Good morning. Munir Ajam with SUKAD with a video on estimating, and this will be part of a series of maybe 3 or more videos. So this is video 1 on estimating, and in this video I'm going to focus on the PMBOK guide versus the real world, and I will be highlighting 4 key messages here. One is definition. What the PMBOK guide talk about is usually the estimating techniques. We will talk about estimate classification. We will talk about estimating and stage versus project. And we will have a word about historical data. So these are the 4 major topics I want to highlight in this short video. Now, obviously, why do we use the PMBOK guide versus the real world? That doesn't mean the PMBOK guide does not reflect the real world, but however, the PMBOK guide, as we know, is not a methodology. So the PMBOK guide, especially in some of the topics, we need to understand the intent of the guide. So when it comes to estimating, the guide talked about estimating techniques. We hear about analogous estimating, we hear about parametric estimating, bottom-up estimating, top-down. These are what we call estimating techniques. These are the techniques we use to estimate a project or to estimate a stage of the project or maybe even a major deliverable of a project. So the technique is usually appropriate to the level of definitions that we have, and I will be discussing this maybe in another video. So we need to understand this concept, okay? Which is different than the estimate classification. The PMBOK guide doesn't highlight that a lot. Usually you need to refer maybe to some other literatures or maybe the Association for Advancement of Cost Engineer International. They have a classification system. Usually a classification system is a categorization, is a way we use to help us define what we call an estimate class. And they use usually class 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, which is 5 with the least detail or the least accurate, with 1 the highest definition that the classification system has. So what organizations like AACE tell us and other literature is that they come up with about 5 different estimate classification to use on a project life cycle. Now, does it mean we have to use all 5 on every project? No. Usually, most capital project, if you are a project owner organization, you use 3 of the 5. And maybe your service provider, your contractor, your engineering consultant, your construction companies will do more estimating. But from a project owner perspective, maybe we use 3 estimate. I will show you what those 3 estimate later, or 3 estimate classification in the video, in this video, a little bit later. Then we talk about estimating. So before we move on to point 3, again, 1 is more of a technique, the approach, the style we use to estimate something, and that's usually a function of the level of information that we have or the level of scope definitions that we have. Now, how do we use these 2 concepts to go to point 3? And in point 3, we will talk about 2 points, estimating at the stage level versus the project level. So if we look at the project management body of knowledge, the guide to the project management of knowledge, body of knowledge, the PMBOK guide, basically it highlights for us the 5 process group: initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing. Obviously, what the PMBOK guide is telling us, directly or indirectly, is that if you are in the initiating process, you do not have the plan yet. So at best, you can probably use analogous estimating technique. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of this technique, but analogous estimating, it's more of a high-level technique. Said, look, we've done something like this before. It cost us so much money. On this project, it will cost us something similar, and we will have to make some adjustment, maybe relation to the size or maybe the time of the project. Maybe that project was done 5 years ago, so we will have to include some escalation or inflation to bring it to today's currency. So if we are in the initiating processes, obviously when we are talking about the charter, the best we can do is maybe use this kind of analogous estimating technique that is very high level. We don't have detail. However, when we go into planning, we probably be able to do more than analogous estimating, because ideally, if we have done the planning and we have done the work breakdown structure, then we have the work packages, then we can estimate what the PMBOK says bottom up. Yeah? We will be able to estimate at the work package level, or maybe even at a lower level, in order to come up with the total project cost. So in this situation, what kind of estimating technique we use? Obviously, for the stage level, if we're talking about the stage level, yes, we will use analogous technique if we are in initiating, and we might use bottom up if we are in planning. However, how do we use the classification system in relationship to the project? Give me a minute and I'll come to that, because I'll have to erase this and draw it for you. But before we go there, let me touch on this point. Often enough, people will say, well, analogous estimating use historical data, and maybe the concept or the misunderstanding is historical data or historical record are used for analogous estimating. Well, technically speaking, that's correct, but is only part of the story, or one side of the coin. Technically, in an organization that have accepted project management and have been building organizational project management and processes and procedures and system, you should have historical data at the highest level and at the lowest level. So all estimating, cost or schedule, should be depending on historical record. Parametric estimating require historical record. Bottom-up estimating require historical record. So the word historical record here, I just put it here in this video to touch on the concept that it's all estimating should depend on historical record. And this is why we always insist on properly closing a project. Because when we properly close a project or a phase, that is where we need to collect the project performance information and add it to the organizational record and the organizational knowledge base in order for us to be able to improve our estimating system, our estimating procedures, and our future estimate on future project. Now, one more, I have to say this as well here, is the PM role. That kind of relate to everything we're talking about here. Often as well, if you study the PMBOK guide, it makes it sound like the project manager is the jack of all trades. The project manager is doing everything. The project manager developing the plan, the communication, estimating, scheduling, where in reality, that's not always the case. Because often enough, especially on the different organization, the project manager role, how would I say this? It is more of supervising, guiding, not necessarily doing. So probably we'll have cost estimator to do this. So that's very important to highlight, as well as that as we understand basically the real world versus the PMBOK guide. Now let's pause for a second. Allow me to erase this, and I'll have to explain estimating. I'll have to estimate estimating for the project. To do this, I have to draw the life cycle, and I will draw the life cycle we use in SUKAD, which is, if we talk about project life cycle as end-to-end, basically we go through stages. We will have a concept stage. We will have a feasibility stage. We have a requirement stage. Okay? We have PM plan. We have detailed plan, and then we have delivery phase. Now, I'm not going to expand on that, because when we're talking about estimating, usually we are focusing on this area, which is the first two phases of the project. This will be what we call the discovery phase. And is this what we call the development phase? And of course, that's the delivery phase, which could be quite extensive. We're just not showing it there. So we are focusing on this first part when we talk about estimating, because usually final approval of the project, again here I'm using maybe capital project, but ideally what we say, the final approval of the project should happen at this point. This should be the final approval. This is when we approve the money. Sorry, I messed it up. Let me just make sure. So the final approval happened at this time. Well, but how do we use the estimate classification here? Well, ideally, and I'm going to use the SUKAD way, camp classification system, not AACE or somebody else. And what we say is usually, when you are preparing your feasibility study, you have to do an estimate. Because your feasibility study has to be a function of the cost and the schedule of the project. And in the camp model, we call this as the class 1. Now, I will talk about estimate accuracy in the next video. But that is the first estimate, and usually based on that estimate, management would issue at this point in time what SUKAD called the project authorization document, or what PMI call the project charter. So that's happening at the end of the feasibility study is when we issue this. But that is based on the class 1 estimate. Now, obviously, just a word here, this whole phase, and the PMBOK says it's outside the project life cycle, we include it in our project life cycle. So basically, when we do the feasibility study, we must have some estimate. The accuracy of this estimate is questionable. Again, we'll talk about that in the next video, but it should be good enough to allow us to authorize the project or initial approval. And then as we define the requirement, as we start to do the project management planning, we typically do another estimate, which is what we call the class 2. Now, as you can imagine, this estimate depends on more detail than this, so it should be more accurate, but we think still not accurate enough to approve the project. And this is why when we do the detailed planning, the detailed definition of the project, we do here the class 3, and that class 3 is what we use for the final approval. And typically, the most common practice in many organizations, this is what some people call the plus or minus 10% estimate. Okay? So let's summarize and close this video. The PMBOK guide is not a methodology, and this is why the PMBOK guide cannot and does not explain this sequence for us, because this is often highly dependent on the industry and the type of the project and the project life cycle. The PMBOK guide tells us that we should think this way, but doesn't give us an example. So this is not a critique of the guide. It's impossible for the guide to address every industry. Again, this is maybe capital project, but this concept could apply in more than one industry. But definitely is not for all projects. So the PMBOK guide highlight techniques. Tell us we use technique. Obviously, in this case, we probably depend more on analogous estimating technique because we don't have detail. Here, we might be able to mix between some bottom-up, some parametric, and some analogous. Here, we might even use some analogous estimating here, but it most likely will probably be bottom-up detail estimating. So, class 1, class 2, class 3 is classification, analogous, parametric, bottom-up, or we can also use factoring and scaling estimate. Let's not go into those details today. Those are technique of estimate. Okay, we will wrap it up on this video. Until the next one.